One lie can ruin everything, one murder can shatter a village. Are you ready to uncover it? Welcome to Unsolved Mystery Vault. I'm your moderator Falcon. Share your thoughts in the comments. I love seeing where you're joining from. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1: The Mirror at the Garden Party. The village of Brambleton-on-Hill prided itself on being the sort of place where nothing truly dreadful ever happened. It was a small, well-ordered village folded neatly into the green shoulders of the Wiltshire Downs, a place of clipped hedges, white gates, and carefully guarded reputations. On the afternoon of the Hawthorn Garden fete, Brambleton looked particularly pleased with itself. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a striped canvas awning at a small round table near the rose beds of Hawthorn House, her gloved hands folded upon her handbag, her pale blue eyes quietly attentive to the world before her. The fete was proceeding precisely as it always did. There were jam tarts arranged in faultless circles, a modest display of hand-knitted baby garments, and a tombola table manned by Mrs. Avery, who was already explaining, rather loudly, that she had once won a silver spoon at the very same stall, many years ago, and that good fortune, she believed, often ran in families. Miss Marple listened kindly. She always listened. Sir Gerald Hawthorn, the owner of Hawthorn House and patron of the Village Hall Restoration Fund, moved through his guests with genial authority. Tall, florid, and ostentatiously hardy, he wore the expression of a man who liked to believe himself indispensable to other people's happiness. Near the tea tent stood his wife, Lady Margaret Hawthorn, smiling faintly, her gaze drifting repeatedly towards the French windows at the rear of the house. She had not stopped doing so for the last 20 minutes. A few yards away, Miss Marple observed Eleanor Price, the village schoolteacher for nearly 15 years, standing rigidly beside the cake stall. She had baked 3 loaves and a lemon drizzle cake. All were untouched. Eleanor's mouth remained set in the thin, courteous line she adopted whenever she felt obliged to make small talk. Not far from her, Peter Lockwood, recently returned from London and temporarily lodged at Rose Cottage, leaned against the apple tree and smoked with careless elegance. He was handsome in a way that made people speak slightly too quickly when addressing him. He had already offered to help pack up the stalls later and had said it loudly enough for several people to hear. Miss Marple noticed how often he glanced toward the house. At the edge of the lawn, half concealed by the herb garden, Mrs. Beatrice Coleman sat alone. Widowhood had narrowed her shoulders and sharpened her eyes. She did not participate in village life so much as observe it, and there was something in the watchfulness of her expression that reminded Miss Marple of a small, patient bird waiting for crumbs. From the open windows of Hawthorn House drifted the muted sounds of classical music. Sir Gerald had insisted that the drawing-room be open to visitors later in the afternoon, an opportunity, he said, for villagers to admire a recent acquisition. The mirror. It was mentioned often. Sir Gerald had spoken of it repeatedly during the past fortnight. A tall, gilded cheval glass dating from the late 18th century, purchased at considerable expense from a London dealer. A thing of real distinction, he had declared. Lady Hawthorn, Miss Marple had noticed, had never joined in those declarations. Instead, she watched the windows. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from young Anna Fletcher, who was home from university and assisting with the refreshments. The girl bent close, lowering her voice. "They say Sir Gerald paid more for that mirror than for the new village bus shelter," she whispered with youthful relish. Miss Marple smiled. "Well, my dear," she said gently, "people do have very different ideas about what is useful." Anna laughed and hurried away. Miss Marple lifted her teacup and sipped. It was remarkable, she reflected, how often people revealed their priorities in such small, careless remarks. At precisely 3:15, Sir Gerald clapped his hands for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen. If you would care to step inside for just a moment, I should like to show you something rather special." A ripple of interest passed through the crowd. Lady Hawthorn's smile flickered. Miss Marple rose slowly with the others and followed the gentle press of villagers towards the French windows. The drawing-room of Hawthorne House was cool and shadowed after the brightness of the lawn. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows and fell directly upon the object of Sir Gerald's pride. The mirror stood near the far wall, its ornate gilded frame curling and flowering around the glass. It was taller than a man. It caught the light and scattered it softly across the polished floor. The villagers murmured appreciatively. Sir Gerald positioned himself beside it, one hand resting possessively upon the carved edge. "Quite something, isn't it?" he said. Miss Marple stood near the doorway, her eyes moving not to the mirror, but to the reflections it offered. She saw Lady Hawthorne's face, pale and carefully arranged. She saw Eleanor Price's tense shoulders. She saw Peter Lockwood's faintly amused expression. And she saw, standing behind Sir Gerald in the reflection, a shape moving at the edge of the open door that led into the small morning room. The movement was slight. Almost nothing at all. A moment later, Sir Gerald's voice broke off. There was a short, confused sound, half breath, half cry. Several people would later insist they heard glass shatter. In truth, the mirror did not break. It was Sir Gerald Hawthorne who fell. He staggered forward, his hand sliding uselessly down the gilded frame, and collapsed heavily upon the Persian rug at Miss Marple's feet. For an instant, no one moved. Then Lady Hawthorne screamed. The crowd surged. Miss Marple remained quite still. Sir Gerald lay face down. His body was unnaturally twisted, one arm bent sharply beneath him. A thin line of blood crept from beneath his collar and stained the pale carpet. Dr. Lewis, the village physician, pushed forward at once, his expression already grave. He knelt, turned Sir Gerald carefully, and placed 2 fingers against the man's throat. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. "I'm afraid," he began. Lady Hawthorne swayed and would have fallen had Mrs. Avery not caught her. Miss Marple's gaze, however, had returned to the mirror. The glass was flawless. But near the lower edge of the frame, almost hidden by a curling leaf of gold, a faint dark smear marked the corner. Not blood. Something else. Polish, perhaps. Or varnish. Or the residue of a hurried, careless touch. Miss Marple looked up. In the reflection, she saw Eleanor Price's hand pressed tightly to her mouth. She saw Peter Lockwood take one involuntary step backwards. She saw Mrs. Beatrice Coleman standing very straight, her eyes fixed not on the body, but on Lady Hawthorne's face. And she saw, just for an instant, the unmistakable expression of relief cross someone's features before it could be smoothed away. It was a very small thing. So small that no one else appeared to notice. Miss Marple folded her hands together and waited. A village, she had learned, was much like a looking glass. It reflected exactly what people wished others to see. But every mirror, however beautiful, could be made to lie. Chapter 2, The Vanished Smear. Miss Marple did not look at the mirror at once. She had learned, over many years of village life, that when something disappears, the important thing is not its absence, but the person who first realizes it is gone. Peter Lockwood stood near the doorway of the morning room, smiling faintly, answering Dr. Lewis with distracted civility. He tugged lightly at his shirt cuff, as though something there irritated him. Miss Marple watched the movement with mild interest. The mirror had been polished to a high, gleaming finish. The gold leaf along its frame caught the light in soft, extravagant curves. Where the faint smear had been only moments before, there was now nothing, no shadow, no dullness, no trace of handling at all. Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair and moved a little closer. It was perfectly natural, she reflected, that a person might wish to tidy a room after an accident. One could hardly blame them for that. It was a kindly instinct. Only, no one had yet spoken of cleaning. And no one had mentioned the mirror. She examined the carved corner with innocent absorption, as though admiring the craftsmanship. It was very well done. Excessive, perhaps. Sir Gerald had never been fond of understatement. Behind her, voices murmured. I expect he must have slipped. It was the rug, I always said those corners curled up. He looked flushed all afternoon, you know. Miss Marple turned. Mrs. Avery had returned from upstairs and was speaking earnestly to Mrs. Fletcher. Her tone was firm with certainty. He overworked himself, that's what it was. Dr. Lewis did not correct her. The absence of contradiction, Miss Marple thought, was often more eloquent than a denial. Peter Lockwood drifted toward the sideboard again. Terribly stuffy in here, he said lightly. Do you mind if I fetch my jacket from the morning room? Constable Reed, who had been attempting to write notes while listening to two people at once, nodded distractedly. Yes, yes. Just be quick, please. Peter disappeared through the door. Miss Marple noticed Eleanor Price stiffen. Her eyes fixed on the doorway, and for the first time since Sir Gerald had fallen, she moved. Not toward the door, but one careful step away from it. Miss Marple regarded her with gentle curiosity. The movement, she thought, had been instinctive. A few seconds later Peter returned, shrugging into his jacket. There we are, he said cheerfully. He caught Miss Marple's eye and smiled. She smiled back. It was a very small, polite exchange. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, it was always interesting how people behaved when they believed themselves no longer under observation. Constable Reed cleared his throat. Dr. Lewis tells me there was no sign of illness before today. So at the moment we must consider this, well, unusual. A murmur rippled through the room. Unusual? Mrs. Avery repeated sharply. Yes, ma'am. I mean, sudden. Miss Marple lowered herself once more into her chair. Sudden was a word that allowed many possibilities. Mrs. Beatrice Coleman leaned closer. He didn't strike his head on the fireplace, did he? She asked quietly. No, said the constable. He fell forward. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, replaying the moment in her mind. The sudden halt in Sir Gerald's voice. The half-formed cry. The hand sliding down the gilded frame. People collapsed in many ways. They clutched, they reached, they twisted. But they did not usually cry out first. Dr. Lewis spoke gently. There will be a post-mortem, of course. A collective discomfort followed. Eleanor Price's breathing quickened. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. My dear Miss Price, she said softly, would you care for some water? You look quite faint. Eleanor started, as though addressed from a long distance. Oh, no. No, thank you. Her voice was thin. Miss Marple did not press the matter. She had only wished to hear how the words emerged. They were sharp. Too sharply pronounced. People who were merely distressed tended to blur their sentences. Peter Lockwood, on the other hand, laughed lightly. It all feels rather melodramatic, doesn't it? He said. I mean, Gerald was never exactly fragile. There was a sudden stillness. It was a poor choice of name. Lady Hawthorne, descending the stairs at that moment with Mrs. Avery beside her, stopped short. Her face hardened. Please do not call my husband Gerald, she said. The room froze. Peter colored. I'm sorry. I didn't think. No, she said quietly. You didn't. Miss Marple observed Lady Hawthorne closely. The woman's composure was remarkable. Her hands were steady. Her back straight. But her eyes moved, restlessly, to the mirror. And then, just as quickly, to Peter Lockwood's sleeve. Miss Marple followed the glance. On the pale cuff, half hidden beneath the edge of his jacket, was the faintest dull streak. Almost invisible. The sort of mark that would vanish with a little water. Or a handkerchief. Or a moment alone in a quiet room. Miss Marple folded her hands together. It was not evidence. It was merely behavior. And behavior, she had always found, told far more truth than any mirror ever could. Chapter 3: The Needle in the Reflection. Lady Hawthorne turned away almost at once, as though ashamed of having allowed her gaze to linger upon Peter Lockwood's sleeve. "I should like to sit in the small parlor," she said quietly. "If you do not mind." Constable Reed stepped forward immediately. "Of course, Lady Hawthorne. Mrs. Avery, perhaps you would stay with her." Miss Marple watched the small, subdued procession leave the drawing-room. Mrs. Avery's arm was firm, almost proprietorial, about Lady Hawthorne's elbow. People who were determined to remain composed, Miss Marple reflected, were often very particular about where they chose to sit. The drawing-room felt suddenly overfull. Outside, through the tall windows, bunting still fluttered gently above the abandoned fete tables, the brightness of the afternoon continuing with faint indecency. Dr. Lewis glanced at his watch. The inspector from Market Ashford should be here shortly. Almost as if summoned, the front bell rang. Inspector Grant was shown in a few moments later, a compact, quietly alert man whose eyes seemed to take in the room before any words were exchanged. The closed door of the morning room, the mirror beside it, the uneasy gathering of villagers, all were noted in one swift, economical glance. Constable Reed spoke in a low voice, giving a brief outline of what had happened. Inspector Grant listened without interruption. "I should like to see Sir Gerald," he said. Dr. Lewis led the way to the morning room. Peter Lockwood moved instinctively forward. "This way." The inspector's gaze flicked to him. "Thank you. I can manage." Peter stepped back at once. The door closed. For a moment, no one spoke. Miss Marple waited. It was in waiting, she had discovered, that people most often betrayed themselves. Eleanor Price sank slowly into a chair. Her fingers were tightly interlaced in her lap. "I still can't quite believe it," she whispered. Mrs. Beatrice Coleman's mouth tightened. "Life has a way of surprising us," she said. "Not always in the ways we imagine," Miss Marple murmured gently. The morning room door opened again. Inspector Grant emerged alone. "I'm afraid Sir Gerald was dead before he struck the floor," he said quietly. A ripple of sound passed through the room. "There is," the inspector continued, "a small puncture wound at the base of the neck." The silence that followed was different, sharper, more alert. Miss Marple felt rather than saw Eleanor Price draw in a sudden breath. "A wound?" Mrs. Avery's voice floated faintly from the parlor doorway. "Yes," said the inspector. "Something thin. A pin or a needle, perhaps." The word lingered uncomfortably. Peter Lockwood gave a short, incredulous laugh. "A needle? That seems rather dramatic, doesn't it?" Inspector Grant regarded him mildly. "It depends where such a needle might be found." His eyes moved calmly across the room. Miss Marple's thoughts returned at once to Sir Gerald's half-formed cry, the curious sound. That had broken his speech before his body had even begun to fall. The inspector went on. "I shall need to speak to you all again. And until further notice, I must ask that no one enters the morning room." His gaze rested for a fraction of a second upon Peter Lockwood. "Of course," Peter said quickly. Inspector Grant turned first to Eleanor Price. "You were standing near the cake stall, Miss Price?" "Yes." "You knew Sir Gerald Hawthorne well?" "Well enough," she replied, after a moment. "He was chairman of the school trustees." "Was," the inspector repeated quietly. A faint tightening passed over Eleanor's mouth. "And you, Mrs. Coleman?" "I live next door," said Mrs. Coleman calmly. "I see Lady Hawthorne most mornings." "And Sir Gerald?" "Not often." A brief hesitation preceded the answer. The inspector made a note. When he turned to Miss Marple, his expression softened slightly. "And you, madam?" "I am staying with my niece here in Brambleton," said Miss Marple. "I live in St. Mary Mead." "And what did you observe?" Miss Marple paused, choosing her words with care. "That everyone was looking at Sir Gerald," she said gently. "And before that?" "And before that, no one was looking at the person who had just left the room behind him." Inspector Grant stilled. "Who was that?" "I could not quite see," Miss Marple said apologetically. "Only a movement, in the reflection of the mirror." His eyes lifted immediately to the tall glass. "A reflection," he repeated. "Yes." She offered no more. He nodded slowly. "That will be all for now." The questioning continued around the room, quiet and methodical. Miss Marple's attention drifted instead to the small, practical details of the room. A low table stood beside the morning room door. Upon it rested a silver tray and a cut-glass dish of mints. One mint lay slightly apart from the others. The wrapper was crushed. Miss Marple was quite certain it had not been so earlier. She rose gently and moved a little closer, appearing to admire the needlework on the back of a nearby chair. The wrapper bore a faint greenish stain. Peppermint. And something darker. Her eyes lifted to the closed morning room door. Then, very quietly, she looked across at Peter Lockwood. He stood near the window now, speaking animatedly to Dr. Lewis. One hand rose, absently, to his cuff. He rubbed at it with his thumb. Miss Marple felt a familiar tightening beneath her ribs. Not certainty. Only recognition. Inspector Grant's voice cut across the room. "Dr. Lewis?" "Yes?" "In your opinion, how quickly would such a wound cause collapse?" "Almost immediately," said the doctor. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief instant. Almost immediately. Which meant that whoever had stood close enough to Sir Gerald Hawthorne to strike him had also stood close enough to steady themselves as he fell. Or to lean, very lightly, against the edge of a gilded mirror, and leave behind a mark that someone later thought it worth their while to remove. Chapter 4, A Courtesy Too Timely. The inspector's quiet exchange with Dr. Lewis seemed to release the tension in the room only slightly. No one spoke for several seconds afterward. The villagers stood in small, uncertain groups, their attention drifting repeatedly to the closed morning room door, as though the truth itself were being kept behind it. Inspector Grant folded his notebook and looked up. "I shall need a few private conversations," he said calmly. "One at a time, if you please." No one argued. Mrs. Avery was asked to remain with Lady Hawthorne. The rest were directed to wait in the drawing room while the inspector conducted his interviews in the small study off the hall. Miss Marple did not volunteer to go first. She never did. Eleanor Price was summoned. She rose so quickly that her chair scraped sharply against the floor. Miss Marple watched her walk from the room. The set of her shoulders was stiff and deliberate, as though she were bracing herself against something unseen. Peter Lockwood exhaled softly. "Poor woman," he murmured. "She was always dreadfully sensitive." Miss Marple glanced at him. "Were you very well acquainted with Miss Price?" she asked gently. Peter smiled with polite surprise. "Not particularly. Everyone knows everyone here, don't they?" "That is very true," said Miss Marple. But the answer had not quite met the question. Mrs. Beatrice Coleman leaned forward slightly. "He's taking a long time with her," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." They waited. From the hall came the faint murmur of voices, too low to be distinguished. Miss Marple noticed that Peter Lockwood had chosen a position from which he could see the study door without appearing to watch it. When Eleanor finally returned, she moved directly to the window and remained standing, her back to the room. Inspector Grant called next for Mrs. Coleman. She rose without hesitation. Her manner, Miss Marple thought, was almost too composed. While Mrs. Coleman was gone, Peter spoke again. "Ghastly business for Lady Hawthorne," he said. "I can't imagine how she's bearing it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "She seems a very private person." "Yes," he said thoughtfully. "Perhaps she had to be." The remark hovered oddly between sympathy and something more deliberate. Mrs. Coleman returned after only a short time. Her face betrayed nothing. Inspector Grant stood in the doorway. "Miss Marple?" She rose at once. The study was small and orderly. A single lamp glowed on the desk, though the afternoon light was still strong. Inspector Grant gestured to a chair. "I should like to hear again what you noticed before Sir Gerald collapsed." Miss Marple folded her hands upon her bag. "Very little, I'm afraid." "Try," he said kindly. She did. "I was looking at the mirror," she explained. "It is such an impressive object. One cannot help seeing people in it." "And what did you see?" "A door opening," she said softly. "The morning room door." "And someone leaving?" "I believe so." "Can you describe the person?" Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "No." He nodded. "You mentioned that no one else was looking at this person." "Yes." "How can you be sure?" Miss Marple paused. "Because everyone else was watching Sir Gerald." The inspector's mouth twitched faintly. "And you noticed something on the mirror frame?" She met his gaze. "Yes." "What?" "A mark." He waited. "I could not tell what had made it." "And now?" "It is no longer there." He made a note. "Who do you believe removed it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh, I wouldn't like to say." "Then why mention it?" Miss Marple looked at him mildly. "Because someone thought it worth removing." The inspector closed his notebook. "That will be all, Miss Marple." She rose and returned quietly to the drawing room. Peter Lockwood looked up at once. "All finished?" he asked lightly. "For the moment," she replied. Inspector Grant followed her out. "I would like a word with you, Mr. Lockwood." Peter's smile remained fixed. "Of course." They disappeared together into the study. The waiting began again. Miss Marple seated herself beside Mrs. Coleman. "I wonder," Mrs. Coleman said quietly, "whether they will let us go home this evening." "I expect so," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Coleman hesitated. "It is dreadful to be trapped like this." "Yes," said Miss Marple. Her eyes moved to Eleanor Price, still standing at the window. It was not dread that held her there. It was vigilance. Peter returned from the study some minutes later. His expression was good-humored, almost relieved. "Nothing very exciting," he announced. "They simply wanted to know why I'd been helping Gerald with some of the village accounts recently." Miss Marple noted again the careless use of Sir Gerald's name. Inspector Grant emerged shortly afterward. "Thank you all for your patience. I believe that will be sufficient for today." There was an unmistakable loosening of tension. "You may return to your homes," he continued. "I will contact you if I require further assistance." A few startled murmurs followed. Miss Marple, however, saw Dr. Lewis glance quickly at the inspector, and then at Peter Lockwood. Something unspoken passed between them. The villagers began to collect coats and handbags with subdued relief. As Miss Marple moved slowly toward the door, she heard Eleanor Price speak at last. "Inspector?" He turned. "There is something I ought to say." The room stilled. Eleanor's voice trembled. "I saw Sir Gerald earlier, just before everyone was called into the drawing room." "In the corridor?" "Yes," said the inspector. "He was arguing with someone." A murmur ran through the room. "With whom?" Inspector Grant asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated. Her eyes lifted. "And went, unmistakably, to to Lady Hawthorne's closed parlor door. I couldn't hear the words, she whispered. But I knew the voice. Miss Marple's gaze shifted gently to Mrs. Coleman. And then, just as quietly, to Peter Lockwood. Chapter 5, The Voice in the Corridor. No one moved. Eleanor Price's words seemed to have fixed the air in place, as though sound itself had become suddenly dangerous. Inspector Grant regarded her steadily. You recognize the voice? Yes, she said faintly. And you are certain? Eleanor swallowed. I've known it for years. The silence deepened. Behind the closed parlor door, Lady Hawthorne remained unseen. Miss Marple felt, rather than observed, the subtle realignment of attention in the room. The villagers did not look at Eleanor now. Nor at the inspector. They looked, instinctively, towards the narrow strip of polished wood that marked the edge of the parlor door. Inspector Grant spoke quietly. Did you see either of the people involved in this disagreement? No. Only heard them. Was Sir Gerald's voice raised? Yes. And the other? Eleanor hesitated. Not raised. Controlled. The word had an oddly deliberate sound. Inspector Grant nodded. Thank you, Miss Price. She seemed relieved to be dismissed. The murmur that followed was immediate and poorly restrained. Poor Lady Hawthorne. I always thought things weren't quite. He could be very sharp, Sir Gerald. Miss Marple did not join the whispering. She watched Mrs. Beatrice Coleman instead. The older woman's expression was thoughtful rather than shocked. As though she were quietly fitting a familiar piece into an already crowded puzzle. Inspector Grant raised his hand. I shall speak with Lady Hawthorne before I leave. Mrs. Avery emerged from the parlor at once. She is very tired, she said firmly. I will be brief, said the inspector. He disappeared into the parlor. The door closed. Again, the room waited. Miss Marple found herself standing beside Eleanor Price. My dear, she said gently, that must have been very uncomfortable for you. Eleanor turned quickly. Yes. The answer came too quickly. You were quite certain of the voice? Eleanor nodded. Miss Marple did not ask whose voice it was. People were often much more willing to volunteer what they wished to be known. Peter Lockwood approached with a practiced air of concern. Are you all right, Miss Price? I am quite well. He smiled faintly. You've been terribly brave. Miss Marple noticed the word. Not honest. Not helpful. Brave. The parlor door opened. Inspector Grant emerged alone. His face revealed nothing. I shall be in touch, he said. He nodded to Constable Reed and made for the front hall. The constable followed. Within moments, the house seemed to exhale. The villagers drifted out quietly, coats and handbags gathered with subdued haste. Miss Marple walked slowly down the gravel drive beside Mrs. Coleman. It will not take long, Mrs. Coleman said thoughtfully, before everyone knows what Eleanor meant. No, Miss Marple agreed. And they will not be very kind. Mrs. Coleman sighed. No. They parted at the gate. The sun was already sinking behind the hedgerows when Miss Marple returned to her niece's small borrowed sitting room. The tea had long since gone cold. She had only just settled herself when there came a soft knock at the door. It was Eleanor Price. Her eyes were red. I'm sorry to disturb you, she said awkwardly. I didn't know where else to go. My dear, do come in, said Miss Marple. Eleanor sat stiffly on the edge of the chair. I shouldn't have said anything. Miss Marple poured fresh tea. It was not unkind to tell the truth, she said. Eleanor stared at the cup in her hands. It was Lady Hawthorne, she whispered. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes. They were arguing about money. Miss Marple remained silent. Sir Gerald wanted her to release funds from her own trust, Eleanor continued, her voice low and urgent. For the village hall. He said it would look badly if she refused. And she? She said the money was not his to offer. Miss Marple stirred her tea. And that was all you heard? Eleanor shook her head. He said something else. What was that? That if she did not agree, he would be forced to remind her how very much the village already owed him. Miss Marple looked up. And what did you understand by that? Eleanor hesitated. There were things, years ago. About Sir Gerald and a former secretary. It was very nearly a scandal. Lady Hawthorne helped prevent it. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. I remember something of the sort. Eleanor stared at her. You do? Oh yes, said Miss Marple mildly. Villages remember such things for a very long time. Eleanor's hands trembled. Everyone will think she killed him. Miss Marple did not deny it. Instead, she asked quietly, why did you wait until now to mention the argument? Eleanor's eyes filled. Because I heard something else. Miss Marple waited. When Sir Gerald fell, Eleanor whispered, I heard a sound. Not his voice. What sort of sound? A small, sharp click. Miss Marple's fingers tightened gently around her teacup. Like metal? She asked softly. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. And in the corridor, when you heard the argument, did you hear that sound then? Eleanor frowned. No. Miss Marple smiled very faintly. Thank you, my dear. Eleanor looked bewildered. But, what does it mean? Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she thought of the crushed mint wrapper. Of the green stain. Of the absent jacket. Of the too timely courtesy of carrying a dying man into a quiet room. It means, she said gently at last, that whoever hurt Sir Gerald did not do so while standing in the corridor. Eleanor's breath caught. Miss Marple rose and opened the door for her. And that, she added softly, is a very great deal more important than whose voice you happen to recognize. Chapter 6, What People Carry. By the following morning, Brambleton-on-Hill had done what it always did with distress. It organized it. Small knots of neighbors formed at gateposts and shop counters, exchanging the same carefully rearranged fragments of information. By 11 o'clock, everyone knew that Sir Gerald Hawthorne had argued with his wife shortly before his death. By noon, many were already quite certain that the argument explained everything. Miss Marple listened from a wicker chair beside her niece's front window. Human judgment, she reflected, so dearly loved the shortest path. She had not yet told anyone about Eleanor's visit. Nor about the click. There was no advantage in doing so. Instead, she had made a small, deliberate plan. At 11:30, she walked slowly down the lane toward the village shop. Mrs. Avery was already there. So was Mrs. Coleman. And, rather inevitably, Peter Lockwood. The bell above the door jingled brightly as Miss Marple entered. Good morning, she said. Miss Marple. Mrs. Avery exclaimed at once. Such a dreadful business. I hardly slept a wink. Mrs. Coleman inclined her head. Peter smiled. Good morning. Miss Marple selected a small tin of peppermints from the counter display. They were identical to the ones she had seen in the cut-glass dish at Hawthorne House. She turned the tin over in her hands. Such a pretty wrapper, she said mildly. Mrs. Avery laughed weakly. Yes, and far too tempting. Sir Gerald always insisted on keeping a dish of them in the drawing-room. Did he? Said Miss Marple gently. Oh yes. Said it kept people alert during meetings. Miss Marple paid for the tin and slipped it into her handbag. Do you know, she went on, I was quite surprised yesterday. after the accident, to notice one had fallen from the dish onto the table. Mrs. Avery frowned. "I don't recall that." Mrs. Coleman did. "There was one on the little table by the morning room door," she said slowly. Peter glanced at her sharply. Miss Marple smiled. "They do have a way of escaping, don't they?" She allowed the moment to drift. Then she turned, as if remembering something quite unimportant. "Mr. Lockwood, I wonder if you might help me for just a moment. My niece mentioned you are rather good with figures." Peter looked pleased. "I do my best. It is about a small subscription list for our church back in St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple explained. "I am afraid I have quite confused myself." Mrs. Avery and Mrs. Coleman lingered. Miss Marple produced a folded sheet of paper. It contained no accounts at all. Only a few names and columns. Peter leaned closer. Miss Marple noticed, as she had expected, that he placed his left hand upon the counter and held the paper steady with his right. "You see," she said softly, "I am never quite certain how to arrange the totals." Peter bent lower. And then, very deliberately, Miss Marple tipped her handbag. The small tin of peppermints slipped out and fell open at Peter's feet. Several bright green wrappers scattered across the shop floor. "Oh dear," said Miss Marple anxiously. Peter moved at once to help. He stooped quickly, gathering the wrappers. "Let me." "Thank you, that is very kind." As he straightened, Miss Marple's eyes rested on his hands. There it was. On the pad of his right thumb. A faint, narrow puncture. So small that most people would never notice it at all. Peter followed her gaze. For an instant, something flickered across his face. Then it vanished. "Paper cut," he said lightly. Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "Oh yes. Those are so annoying, aren't they?" She gathered the remaining wrappers herself. But she had already seen enough. The click. The thin wound. The missing smear. And the kindness that had come far too quickly. Mrs. Avery watched Peter with sudden curiosity. "Did you prick yourself yesterday, dear?" Peter laughed. "Always doing something clumsy, I'm afraid." Miss Marple folded her peppermints into her handbag. "Thank you so much for your help," she said. She left the shop quietly. Outside, the village seemed unchanged. But Miss Marple felt the pattern tightening. Because it was not only what people used that mattered. It was what they carried. And what they were careful to remove from their hands before anyone thought to look. Chapter 7, The Thing That Should Not Have Been There. Miss Marple walked home slowly from the village shop, allowing the mild bustle of Brambleton-on-Hill to pass around her without interruption. She had no wish to appear purposeful. Purpose, in a small village, was noticed. It was not yet noon when she reached the narrow footpath that ran behind Hawthorne House and along the old kitchen garden wall. She had chosen it deliberately. The back of the house lay quiet and shuttered, its tall windows closed like unseeing eyes. The fate bunting had been taken down, though one small length still clung stubbornly to the rose arch, fluttering faintly in the light breeze. Miss Marple paused. Near the service gate, half hidden by an overgrown lavender bush, lay a small crumpled object. She stooped with some difficulty and lifted it. A peppermint wrapper. The green paper was torn and flattened, its silver lining faintly dulled, as though it had been handled and then handled again. Miss Marple regarded it thoughtfully. The little table inside the drawing-room had been cleared the previous afternoon. The dish of mince removed, the tray taken away. This wrapper had not been there yesterday morning. And it had no business being here now. She slipped it into her handbag. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Mrs. Beatrice Coleman was approaching along the path. "Oh," she said, a little surprised. "I didn't expect to see anyone here." "I was taking the air," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. Mrs. Coleman's eyes flicked toward the rear of the house. They have not let Lady Hawthorne out at all today. No? No. Mrs. Avery has been with her since breakfast. Miss Marple nodded. And Mr. Lockwood? Mrs. Coleman hesitated. He went into the house earlier. Said he was returning some papers to Dr. Lewis. Something about the accounts. Miss Marple smiled gently. That was very considerate of him. Mrs. Coleman did not return the smile. They walked on together. At the gate, Mrs. Coleman paused. Do you really think, she asked quietly, that Lady Hawthorne could have done such a thing? Miss Marple looked up at her. My dear Mrs. Coleman, I think there are very few things people are truly incapable of doing. It was not quite the answer Mrs. Coleman had hoped for. They parted there. Miss Marple had only just reached her niece's sitting room when the knock came. This time it was Dr. Lewis. I hope I am not disturbing you, he said. Not at all, said Miss Marple warmly. He looked tired. I wondered if I might ask you something. Quite unofficially. She gestured to a chair. Please. He hesitated before speaking. Inspector Grant has been troubled by something. So have I. Miss Marple waited. It is the position of the wound, he said. At the base of the neck, slightly to the right. Yes, said Miss Marple. For someone standing face to face with Sir Gerald, it would be awkward. Miss Marple inclined her head. Unless they were standing slightly behind him. Dr. Lewis looked at her sharply. Yes. And there was something else, he continued. Very slight. But unmistakable. What was that? A trace of peppermint oil. Miss Marple's hands tightened faintly in her lap. On the skin? Yes. Very faint. Possibly transferred from the weapon. Miss Marple smiled gently. How very uncomfortable for you, she said. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Yes. Quite. After he had gone, Miss Marple sat very still. The crushed wrapper in the drawing room. The green stain. The wrapper behind the house. The peppermint oil. People like to steady their nerves with small, habitual comforts. Some people, she thought, relied on them. By mid-afternoon, the village had received its next, inevitable disturbance. A message arrived from Inspector Grant. Would Miss Marple be kind enough to come to Hawthorne House? It was, he added, a matter of some urgency. The drawing-room looked much as it had the previous day, though stripped now of all pretense of hospitality. The mirror still stood in its place. Inspector Grant waited near the fireplace. We have found something, he said without preamble. Dr. Lewis was there. So was Peter Lockwood. Miss Marple noticed that at once. On the small side table lay a folded handkerchief. Inspector Grant lifted it. In the waste bin of the morning room, he said quietly. He unfolded the cloth. At its center was a faint greenish smear. And something darker. Blood. Peter's face remained pleasantly attentive. What exactly do you think that proves? He asked lightly. Inspector Grant did not answer immediately. Instead, he said, we have also found a small leather case beneath the chair where Sir Gerald fell. He opened it. Inside, nestled neatly in velvet, lay a set of fine steel hypodermic needles. There was a soft sound. Eleanor Price, who had been standing near the door, swayed and caught at the wall. I didn't know, she whispered. I never knew he had those. Dr. Lewis spoke quietly. They belonged to Sir Gerald. He used them some years ago when administering medication to horses on his land. Peter laughed softly. How convenient. Inspector Grant's eyes lifted. Very. He closed the case. And we have another small problem, he added. What problem? Peter asked. One of the needles is missing." The silence was abrupt and absolute. Miss Marple's gaze moved, without haste, to Peter Lockwood's right hand. He stood quite still. But his thumb pressed unconsciously into his palm. Inspector Grant went on calmly. "We believed, until now, that the needle must have been removed from the house." He paused. "But this morning, Mrs. Avery discovered something lodged in the lining of the waste bin in the morning room." He opened the handkerchief again. A thin sliver of steel glinted briefly in the light. Peter stared at it. Miss Marple felt the familiar tightening return. Because the needle had not been taken away. It had been thrown away. Which meant the person who used it had not expected anyone to find it at all. And that, she reflected quietly, was the first truly dangerous mistake.
You can't prove anything. The evidence tells its own story.
Chapter 8, A Small Experiment in Kindness. Inspector Grant dismissed Eleanor gently and asked Dr. Lewis to see her safely home. The thin, stunned silence that followed their departure lay heavily upon the drawing room. Peter Lockwood remained by the side table. The folded handkerchief, the glinting fragment of steel, and the small leather case were still before him. Miss Marple observed, without appearing to do so, that he had chosen a position that placed the mirror directly behind her chair. Inspector Grant closed the needle case and slipped it into his pocket. "For the moment," he said quietly, "I should like everyone to remain in the house." His eyes rested on Peter. "Only until I complete a few inquiries." Peter inclined his head pleasantly. "Of course." He showed no irritation. No alarm. Only patience. It was very well done. Miss Marple rose with mild effort. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a glass of water, Mr. Lockwood," she said apologetically. "I find these old houses rather warm." Peter smiled at once. "Certainly." He moved toward the sideboard. Inspector Grant watched him in silence. Miss Marple lowered herself slowly back into her chair. It was time, she felt, for something very small. And very human. Peter returned with the glass and handed it to her. She thanked him. Then, with a slight frown, she peered into her handbag. "How very foolish of me," she murmured. "I seem to have torn my glove." She withdrew the soft cotton glove and turned it in her hands. "A silly thing, but I am always losing the little pins I keep for mending. I cannot imagine where they disappear to." Peter laughed lightly. "They have a habit of doing that." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes. Though one does usually feel them when they go missing." Peter's expression altered, so faintly that only someone watching for it would have noticed. Inspector Grant remained entirely still. Miss Marple leaned forward, peering at the carpet near Peter's feet. "Oh dear. I do believe I have dropped something." Peter moved instantly. "I'll get it." "No, no, please don't trouble yourself," she said, already bending. But he had stooped first. His hand brushed the carpet. Miss Marple saw the movement clearly. Not searching. Sweeping. A small, habitual gesture, one practiced many times. "There's nothing there," he said easily. Miss Marple straightened with a faint air of embarrassment. "I must be mistaken." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "You were very kind yesterday, you know, carrying Sir Gerald into the morning room." Peter's smile returned. "Well, it seemed the natural thing to do." "I expect it did," said Miss Marple gently. Her eyes lifted to the mirror behind him. "And you were so quick." The words were quite harmless. They carried no accusation. Only admiration. Peter's shoulders relaxed. Inspector Grant shifted slightly. Miss Marple continued. "I always think it takes a certain steadiness to lift a person who has collapsed. One must be careful not to drop them." "Yes," Peter said. For a moment, his gaze slid away from hers. Miss Marple waited. And, she went on softly, one does not always realize at first that something small has caught one's hand. Peter laughed again. A splinter, you mean? Yes. She smiled at him kindly. Or something sharper. The word hung between them. Peter's fingers closed around the back of the chair. Miss Marple looked down at her glove again. How curious it is, she murmured, that people often put little comforting habits together. A mint, perhaps. A cigarette. A small ritual before doing something unpleasant. The color drained from Peter's face. It was not sudden. It was careful. As though the blood were withdrawing at a measured pace. Inspector Grant spoke quietly. You were very fond of peppermint, Mr. Lockwood. Peter stared at him. Everyone likes peppermint. Not everyone carries it into the morning room, said the inspector. Peter laughed softly. You have no proof of that. Miss Marple lifted her head. No, she said gently. Peter turned toward her, almost impatiently. You see, Miss Marple? They are building quite a little story. She met his gaze calmly. I think, she said, you built it yourself. There was a stillness. Inspector Grant did not interrupt. Miss Marple continued, very mildly. You went into the morning room after Sir Gerald collapsed. No one questioned that. It seemed thoughtful. You returned without your jacket. Later, you were anxious to go back for it. Peter shrugged. So? And you removed a small mark from the mirror frame, she added quietly. Peter's smile flickered. You cannot possibly know that. No, said Miss Marple. But I can understand it. He stared at her. You were standing very close behind Sir Gerald, she went on gently. Close enough to steady yourself when he lurched. Close enough to reach his neck. Close enough to be splashed, just a little, when the skin broke. Inspector Grant drew a slow breath. Peter laughed. It was not convincing. You think I murdered him with one of his own needles? In a room full of people? Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. The word was astonishingly quiet. Peter's eyes hardened. And why, he demanded softly, would I do that? Miss Marple looked at him with genuine compassion. Because Sir Gerald had begun to recognize certain irregularities in the village accounts, she said. And because you were responsible for helping him prepare them. Inspector Grant spoke at once. We confirmed this morning that several transfers were made to a private account under your name. Peter did not look at him. He was watching Miss Marple. You knew? I suspected, she replied gently. From the way you offered your help so publicly. And from how anxious you were to return papers to Dr. Lewis today that were not his concern at all. Peter's hand moved to his pocket. Inspector Grant's voice sharpened. Do not. Peter stopped. Miss Marple rose. I wanted to see, she said softly, whether you would reach for the floor again when I mentioned my missing pin. His mouth opened. Then closed. He laughed once. It sounded brittle. You are very clever, Miss Marple. No, she said kindly. I am only very familiar with people who carry small sharp things in their pockets, and believe them to be invisible. Chapter 9, The Mirror Finally Speaks. The room was quiet, though the afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across the polished parquet. Miss Marple sat in her usual wicker chair, a calm figure amid the tension that had grown almost tangible in Hawthorne House. Peter Lockwood remained near the sideboard, pale now, his carefully controlled composure showing the first cracks. Inspector Grant and Dr. Lewis lingered near the fireplace, watching without speaking. Miss Marple looked at Peter steadily, her hands folded. You were very careful yesterday, she said softly. Very careful indeed. Peter's eyes flicked to hers, a faint glimmer of unease crossing his otherwise composed expression. "I don't know what you mean," he said lightly. "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple replied, almost gently, as though speaking to a small child. "You arrived after Sir Gerald collapsed, to help, naturally. No one thought twice about that. But your hand, you left a small mark on the mirror frame. And that mark, it was removed before anyone noticed. Quite deliberately, I expect." Peter's fingers twitched. Inspector Grant leaned slightly forward, though he still said nothing. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "when Sir Gerald began to falter, you were right behind him. Not by accident. Not out of kindness alone. Close enough to steady him, close enough to reach, where he was vulnerable. And yet you carried your habitual comforts with you, your peppermint, your handkerchief, and thought them invisible." Peter swallowed. His usual lightness of tone faltered. Miss Marple went on, her voice calm, measured, almost conversational. The small click that Eleanor Price heard, it came from the needle. Thin, precise, intended to administer something swiftly and quietly. That is why no one heard anything in the corridor. That is why you were careful not to touch anything else. The evidence would be minimal. Invisible. Peter's jaw tightened. He looked at the floor, then back at her, eyes sharp now. "Miss Marple," he said finally, "are you accusing me?" "I am merely observing," she said mildly. "Observing human nature as I have done for many years. Some things are never hidden from someone who knows where to look." Inspector Grant cleared his throat. "Mr. Lockwood," he said evenly, "the needle found in the wastebin matches Sir Gerald's set. The puncture on your thumb, too precise to be coincidental. We also have the green stain on the handkerchief, found where you had been standing." Peter's composure snapped. His voice rose sharply, though still controlled. "It was an accident," he exclaimed. I only meant to," he collapsed. "I didn't know he would." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "An accident," she murmured, "does not explain removing the mark from the mirror, nor taking the time to tidy the dish of mints so no one would see. Nor does it explain why the needle was placed in the wastebin rather than returned to the case. Accidents do not require careful forethought or concealment." Peter's hands trembled. The glass he had been holding rattled faintly on the sideboard. Dr. Lewis interjected softly. "Peter, perhaps it would be better to explain now." Peter's mouth moved, words faltering, searching. Sir Gerald, he found out," he whispered. "He noticed the discrepancies. The transfers, the accounts, he was going to, he said he would have to tell the others. I didn't want him to ruin everything. I only wanted to stop him from speaking, just for a moment. I didn't think it would." His voice broke, leaving a tense, heavy silence. Miss Marple watched carefully. Her eyes did not leave him. "You took something small and sharp," she said softly. "And you used it. But you did not account for how quickly he would fall, how fast the world would see. And then you attempted to tidy everything as though nothing had happened. That is why Eleanor Price noticed the click in the corridor. She did not know the details, but her ears told her enough." Peter sank into a chair, head in his hands. Inspector Grant stepped forward. "Mr. Lockwood, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Gerald Hawthorne." Peter looked up once, blankly, as if seeing the world clearly for the first time. Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze gentle. "You see," she said quietly, almost to herself, "people carry small things with them, habits, rituals, little comforts. But they cannot carry secrets with the same ease. And a secret, once acted upon, always leaves a trace. Invisible to most, but never to the quiet observer." Peter did not protest. The carefully maintained mask had fallen completely. Dr. Lewis moved to stand beside the inspector, offering a steady hand. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, allowing a faint, satisfied smile. The room seemed to breathe again, the shadows retreating slightly as the truth settled firmly into place. Even the mirror, tall and gleaming in its gilded frame, seemed to reflect the calm resolution Miss Marple always observed when human nature had been understood, and justice quietly achieved. And though the villagers outside would gossip endlessly about the tragedy, the crime, and the scandal, Miss Marple knew that the smallest, most human details, the gestures, the careful touches, the habits, had done more than any accusation to reveal the murderer. She sat quietly, fingers folded, eyes calm, and allowed the room, for the first time in 2 days, to simply be still. Chapter 10, One Broken Mirror.One Lie, One Murder. The village of Brambleton-on-Hill had settled into a tentative quiet. The initial shock of Sir Gerald Hawthorne's death had softened into whispers, cautious glances, and half-formed theories. Yet beneath this calm, there remained a tension, an awareness that one among them had crossed the boundary between civility and crime. Miss Marple stood by the window in her niece's sitting room, sipping tea, her mind quietly turning over the details of the case. Every gesture, every small habit she had observed in Hawthorne House came to her now like pieces of a finely cut puzzle. The green peppermint wrappers, the folded handkerchief with its faint bloodstain, the needle carefully discarded in the waste bin, the absent jacket, and the removed mark on the mirror, all were threads that, when tied together, formed the unmistakable pattern of guilt. Her niece, bustling softly in the kitchen, glanced toward her. "You are very composed, Aunt Jane," she said. "I could hardly be this calm if such a thing had happened here." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Composure," she said gently, "is not a matter of the nerves but of attention. One notices what others overlook." By mid-morning, Inspector Grant had requested her presence at Hawthorne House. The village was quieter than it had been in days, but the house itself retained the heavy, expectant air of its past tragedy. The mirror in the morning room, tall and polished, seemed to reflect not only the room but every hidden tension that had once passed before it. Inside, Peter Lockwood sat quietly in a chair, pale and taut, under the watchful eyes of Inspector Grant and Dr. Lewis. His earlier confidence had crumbled, the carefully constructed facade of ease now revealed the strain beneath. Miss Marple observed him without haste, her gaze calm and deliberate. "You were very precise," she said softly. "Too precise for an accident. You knew what you were doing, when you approached Sir Gerald, when you steadied him, when you used the needle." Peter's hands twitched. The brittle composure he had maintained for so long began to unravel. I didn't mean," he started, his voice faltering, "I only wanted to stop him. He was going to ruin everything, expose what I'd done with the accounts." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her voice gentle but unwavering. "Yes. You believed it would be harmless, just a small prick, a moment to prevent discovery. But people cannot carry lies as easily as they carry habits. Your carelessness, though meticulous in some ways, left enough evidence for a keen eye to trace." She gestured subtly toward the mirror. "The reflection of your movements, the mark you left, the discarded needle in the waste bin, even Eleanor Price's inadvertent observation of the click in the corridor, all of it led to the truth." Peter's eyes darted to her, a flicker of fear mingled with disbelief. "Miss Marple, how could you know?" "Because," she said gently, "I have watched human nature for many years. I know the gestures that betray the mind, the habits that betray the conscience. And you carried them all with you, even into a room full of witnesses, thinking no one would notice." Inspector Grant stepped forward quietly. "Mr. Lockwood, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Gerald Hawthorne." Peter's expression slackened. The struggle to maintain control had failed, the truth, so carefully avoided, now pressed in from all sides. Miss Marple remained seated, serene. "Observe," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else, "how the smallest details, a wrapper, a handkerchief, a habitual gesture, reveal the greatest truths. No one can fully hide from human observation, not when the pattern of behavior is so clear." Dr. Lewis, standing nearby, exhaled slowly. "The village may think the case is only about money or opportunity," he murmured. "But it is, ultimately, about the habits and choices of the individual." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes. And once someone acts on a hidden resentment, a lie, or greed, even the smallest oversight, like a discarded mint wrapper or the faint green stain of peppermint, becomes a thread that cannot be ignored." Outside, Brambleton-on-Hill carried on as it always did. Children played along the lanes. Dogs barked. Neighbors exchanged cautious greetings. Life resumed its outward calm. Yet inside Hawthorne House, the truth had settled firmly, silent and unyielding. Peter Lockwood would answer for his actions, and the careful balance of the village was restored. But Miss Marple, walking slowly down the gravel path to her niece's house, knew that human nature, its vanities, its habits, its capacity for deception, would always leave traces. And those traces, for those who knew where to look, were enough to reveal even the darkest of secrets. She paused briefly to glance at Hawthorne House, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. One broken mirror, one lie, and one murder, but the web of human behavior had made the hidden visible. And as she continued on her quiet walk, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest smile, for the puzzle was complete, the mystery resolved, and justice, subtle, inevitable, and entirely human, had been served. The village returned to its rhythm. The scandal faded into memory, yet its lesson lingered, quietly, for those who paid attention. Miss Marple sipped her tea once more. Some mysteries, she thought, were not only solved by observation, they were understood by the heart. The case of Sir Gerald Hawthorne was closed. The small details, the small gestures, had spoken the loudest. And life, as ever, continued.